So chapter 1 starts out with a dedication to someone very few people have ever heard of, Theophilus.
And no one knows, yes.
That's right, yeah. Well, what do you know about him?
Yeah, absolutely nothing, but I'm delighted that he's Theophilus, meaning phileo type of love and not agape kind of love, because there's a lot more warmth to it, you see, and much more personal, which I like a lot. And the book of Acts also starts out with comments to the same Theophilus. And so that's sort of a tie in between Luke and Acts, and makes it fascinating to who was the Theophilus. Many think an imaginary character, a lover of God, and that's quite appropriate, maybe so. I have a harebrained scheme or theory that Theophilus was the legal counsel for Paul's trial, and that in the last days of Paul and Luke, that they were working on a brief for the court, for the case that was to go before the emperor, to try to make it so that Christianity would be accepted in the Roman Empire instead of persecuted, and that they worked very hard on it, possibly from Caesarea days, because Paul has been rejoined by Luke at the tail end of the third missionary journey, and as far as we know, stays with him until I think they both died together in the persecutions under Nero. Because the book of Acts never ends, it's cut off at 28 chapters. And Paul obviously dies at about that time. So that's neither here nor there because it's unprovable, but it's fascinating to me, which would also mean both Luke and Acts were written far earlier than most scholarly schemes suggest, which would be more towards 64, 65. If there's a two-part trial instead of 70, 75, or some even put it down to 80 or whatever. So I want to comment, though, that from my perspective, Luke begins this, and then at verse 4, that in the original manuscript, it would have shifted straight to chapter 3, as the narrative carries on, and Luke starts to anchor it in historical stuff that that's more solid than the intervening information. And to me, the first two chapters of Matthew, which we're not talking about, and the first two chapters of Luke, minus his first 4 verses, are spurious. They are not because I don't like them or because of mere human theory, but because the text itself at many places, not just here, but at many places, forbids believing that this is original or historical material. And on top of that, I end up believing, which I won't get into right now, that it's done enormous damage to the faith and to the practice of the faith. So I don't like to go there anymore, because how do you perpetuate error and retain error? You do that by continually honoring the text as if it was not spurious. And so for that reason, I simply say, how do I know whether John the Baptist and Jesus were related? Well, I only know it from this, what to me is undependable information from Luke. And I can see why they would want to relate the two in their minds, because they're trying to merge the two movements. And so I just end up saying we would be so much better off if we could start admitting some mistakes and try to understand our faith better as what is solid in this particular case. And so I wish we'd just drop that material and not keep trying to make some kind of wonderful, wonderful meaning out of it. We don't need it, to tell us anything important about our faith from my perspective.
You emphasize your perspective because you're aware that you're sitting next to somebody with a slightly different perspective, although we share a basis of
I could
agreement.
be sitting next to almost anybody, and that would be true.
We share a basis of agreement, let me make perfectly clear, on some very important matters with respect to what you just said. Neither one of us count these two chapters as historical. So I come from the perspective that it's also a story. I think it's a story like a myth operates as a story, however. I continue to enjoy and derive benefit from, I feel, continuing to go back into this story. There is some theology in it that I find a bit troubling. However, I think there are patterns in this story that are like a myth. A myth isn't meant to simply say what never happened. It's meant to talk about what always happens time and time again. And so to me, the value of these stories is to simply treat them as stories, and ask about what patterns is it revealing that might be worth turning into our own lives, and can we find this pattern in our own experience? As a for instance, and we won't go through the whole chapter, and we don't need to engage in a scholarly debate about why our differences of opinion. I believe that this was original in Luke's gospel, and Bruce doesn't, but that's really immaterial. What I'd like to do is just kind of talk a little bit about those patterns that I see in this story, and focusing on the first chapter. It's a tremendous fun, I think, to put oneself in the sandals of Zechariah and Elizabeth as these events transpire. And you have Zechariah, who's invited to participate in the care and maintenance of the Holy of Holies, and that's a tremendously special opportunity. I mean, a priest of that time, this would have been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, or maybe just only a very few times in a lifetime that you'd actually have the opportunity to go inside the Holy of Holies, where the Jews actually thought God's presence dwelt. And so imagine yourself entering Zechariah's world, being invited to step into this place where you thought that God's presence was there especially for you, in a special way, in an especially close way. Zechariah comes with a request. There's been something on his mind. They want a son. They want a child. And it invites me to ask myself, if I believed that God was present in a special way, that I could bring a request to God, what would that request be? What would I ask if I was presented with that opportunity? I think that's fruitful. He also, in the Holy of Holies, then it's revealed that there will be a birth and of a son, and the name of the son is given. It will be John. And then suddenly Zechariah can't hear, and he can't apparently see. He can't speak. Sorry, he can see. People but have to give him sign language, though, so apparently he can't hear as well. And he stays that way for 9 months. Well, the name John literally means God is gracious, in the Hebrew. And I think that's fascinating, the thought of spending 9 months without being able to hear or speak and contemplating the very last thing you've heard. God is gracious. How would you begin to look at the world? For 9 months, God is gracious. God is gracious. I look at my wife. I see God is gracious. I look at the trees and the birds. God is gracious. I look at all that is around me and keep that word, God is gracious, keeps repeating. What would that do? And then finally, we have the actual birth, and Zechariah is still deaf and dumb, and then it says that they're asking, what's the name of this child? And Elizabeth says, well, it will be John. And they're saying, well, that's not a family name, and maybe you should at least name him Zechariah. And she said, no, John. And finally they turn to Zechariah, and he's got to scroll it out on a tablet, and he says his name is John. And suddenly he can speak. And to me, that asks the question, what is the miracle that gives you voice? This miracle has given him voice somehow. He's acted on it. He's acted on what was revealed, and he's given voice that way. To me, that happens all the time. It is those touches of spirit, when we respond to them and grasp them and trust them, that give us voice in the world. So I find that the story is quite wonderful. Same thing with Mary, and I'm troubled by the connotation anyway. I don't see it as strongly in Luke, nearly as strongly in Luke as I do in Matthew. We disagree on that. I don't think Luke has a very strong a statement about a virgin birth, but you could argue it's in there. But then you have this Magnificat, and she starts uttering these beautiful verses about what the meaning of this child's coming, and we have tended to sanitize that over the years, make this, oh, my soul magnifies the Lord, and that's so sweet and pious. But you actually read the text, and it's quite fiery, and envisions a complete societal transformation. almost you could almost read Marxism into it in some ways, the rich being toppled down and so forth. It's patterned after another hymn that was given over the birth of a child, and also envisioning the toppling of the rich and the exaltation of the lowly. I wouldn't read so much societal revolution, social revolution into it, so much as a revolution of spirit into it, though. Just as we look back at Zechariah and we say, well, he was made deaf and dumb because he didn't believe the miracle at first, and people have typically interpreted that as punishment for Zechariah. I think it's blessing for him. I mean, he's given the opportunity to contemplate God is gracious for 9 long months. I think that we can look at the story, the Magnificat, and see the toppling of the rich and the exaltation of the lowly from a similar perspective, in that when is it that we are all, those of us who are hoity-toity, toppled, and the lowly are exalted, if not in the presence of awe and wonder? Yeah. When we, just as in the physical world, we stand before the Grand Canyon and we see its majesty, its grandeur. I mean, those of us who thought we were really something feel all of a sudden quite small in comparison to that majesty. And yet we can also stand before the Grand Canyon, and if we were feeling down in the dumps, feel uplifted and exalted in the face of that same canyon. So we all stand, no matter whether we're feeling exalted or lowly, we all, the high are lowered and the lowered are exalted there at the base of the canyon. The same thing, I think, in the presence of God's grace and mercy, and the majesty and the awe and wonder of this presence that loves us beyond our wildest imagination. To me, that's the true revolution that's pointed to in Mary's words.